Greetings, people. This is the Mexican American channel. Very glad you could join me. Hit the like button to support the channel. I want to show you some videos on tonight's program.
Typically, when we think of the history of slavery here in Texas, we think of Juneteenth in Galveston. But I'm speaking with a couple of historians today who say we need to think of that history even further south, because decades before Juneteenth, Hispanics were helping enslaved blacks escape to Mexico.
The Mexican government welcomed fugitive slaves.
Documents dating back beyond the 1800s here in the Galveston and Texas History Center that historians Samuel Collins III and Dr. Juan Galvan are showing me give a new outlook on the Underground Railroad, which most equate to the system that helped slaves escape north to freedom.
We often think about Canada, but enslaved people in Texas actually ran south to Mexico because Mexico had outlawed slavery.
Although not everyone describes the help Hispanics gave as work on the railroad.
Because when you say Underground Railroad, that implies a network as sophisticated as the one to Canada.
But Dr. Galvan says research shows Hispanic abolitionists were well organized, as many came together to help thousands of enslaved blacks in Texas make it to freedom in Mexico.
There were many marriages between Mexican men and African-American enslaved women.
Part of the story is that people were not just waiting to be rescued.
Collins says some slaves saved for years to pay to be taken to Mexico. When Texas was still Mexican territory, it was illegal to have slaves here. So slave owners began drafting contracts like this. The papers would claim the people listed, including some as young as 3 years old, agreed to work for them for life.
For the term of 99 years to learn the art and mystery of farming and planting.
So friends to the south stepped in.
For the haters still chewing on crayons, pay attention.
In the summer of 2012, I was doing research in northeastern Mexico about a different topic, about violence on the U.S.-Mexico border in the mid-19th century. And I kept coming across evidence of slaveholders from the United States going to Mexico to try to kidnap their fugitive slaves and then facing resistance from local Mexican citizens and officials. And that really surprised me. I really didn't expect Mexican officials to sometimes risk their lives to protect fugitive slaves. I didn't even know that fugitive slaves were escaping to Mexico. This escape route is something that historians have, I would say, largely overlooked. There have been a couple of articles about it. And I say there are two reasons for why that might be. Slide, please, you might have to click it twice. One reason, of course, is that it requires in-depth research on both sides of the border. I went to a lot of different archives, as John mentioned, some of which were so out of the way that I was actually written up in the local newspaper for having gone to them. Slide. Please. This usually doesn't happen. Usually no one cares when I'm going to an archive. But I think the main reason that this story has been overlooked is the fact that U.S. historians have long assumed that Mexico's government wasn't really committed to anti-slavery policies, and that as a result, those anti-slavery policies buckled easily under pressure from the United States. The problem with that assumption, as I learned over the course of my research, is that it's just not true. Mexico abolished slavery in 1837, and it didn't stop there. 20 years later, it adopted a constitution that not only promised to free all enslaved people within Mexico, but it also promised freedom to enslaved people from other countries from the moment they set foot on Mexican soil, a promise known in the 19th century as the Freedom Principle. Slide. This was incredibly radical. More radical, indeed, than many of the anti-slavery laws with which we're most familiar. Slide. I think everyone who grew up in the United States probably learned about the anti-slavery laws passed by the northern states in the wake of the American Revolution. And it's true that these northern states had either abolished slavery outright or passed gradual emancipation laws that would end slavery within a generation or two. But they did not promise to free enslaved people who escaped from the slaveholding states. They couldn't because of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, which promised to return enslaved people who escaped across state borders. And the same was really true in Canada. Canada, along with the rest of the British Empire, abolished slavery in 1833, but it continued to extradite criminals to the United States, criminals who sometimes happened to be fugitive slaves, as in the case of one runaway in 1842 who was returned to Arkansas for having stolen a gold watch and a racing mare while escaping to Canada. Slide, please. The only country in the Americas that had anti-slavery policies as radical as Mexico's was the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, which revolted against French rule in 1791 and established the Republic of Haiti. Haiti abolished slavery in 1804, and it adopted the freedom principle in its constitution in 1816. And historians have done a lot of really important work over the past decades showing just how important Haitian abolition was, not just to destabilizing slavery in the nearby islands of Cuba and Jamaica, but also by striking fear in the hearts of slaveholders in the United States. But Haiti lay 500 miles by sea from the southernmost tip of Florida. Slide. Mexico, by contrast, directly bordered the US South. And not just any part of the US South, Texas and Louisiana, where slavery was expanding at really rapid rates in the 19th century. And this proximity of Mexico to these spaces of mass chattel slavery meant that its anti-slavery policies would have profound significance for the United States.
Vicente Guerrero was born on August 9th, 1783 in Tixla, now the state of Guerrero in Mexico, to a humble family. His father, Juan Guerrero, was African-Mexican, while his mother, Guadalupe Saldaña, was an indigenous Mexican. Vicente did not have a formal education while growing up, but he dedicated his time to farming activities and working as a mule driver that transports goods. Politically, both of his parents were devout supporters of the Spanish rule in New Spain. Slavery had existed well before the discovery of the New World. However, the commerce of Africans became important for Europe only after the 15th century when they began to settle there and build colonies. The first Africans in New Spain accompanied explorers and conquistadors like Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortez. Later, enslaved Africans were taken to work in cotton fields or sugar plantations, cultivating coffee, tobacco, and rice, mining minerals, and other painful physical work. Gradually, Blacks started to take roles previously performed by indigenous, whose population steadily declined from years of abuse from conquistadors, as well as the introduction of European diseases such as smallpox, measles, pneumonia, typhus, cholera, and bubonic plague brought by the Spaniards. Most of the enslaved were men, but also women and children were included. Vicente's journey as a national hero began while traveling around New Spain and becoming familiar with the growing independence movement and meeting José María Morelos y Pavón, a leader of the rebellious movement. Vicente started his military career in 1810 after meeting Morelos and participated in many important engagements. After Morelos was executed by a Spanish firing squad in 1815, Vicente became the new commander-in-chief of the insurgent army. Vicente became more powerful with every victory, and in an effort to stop him, the Spaniards in 1819 convinced his father to beg his son to offer his sword and surrender to the Viceroy of New Spain. Instead, Vicente said defiantly, "Brothers, this old man is my father. He has come to offer me rewards in the name of the Spaniards. I have always respected my father, but my motherland comes first." Even after losing a majority of his forces, Vicente continued to fight in southern New Spain with only a handful of remaining insurgents. Even though Vicente's band was defeated, years of fighting took a heavy toll on the Spanish. On February 24, 1821, the leader of the Spanish forces, General Agustín de Iturbide, decided to make peace with Vicente to stop the war that had lasted more than 10 years. The two men met, and the agreement was sealed with the well-known the Acatempan hug, because the two men's embrace occurred in that city on February 10, 1821, when both legions united to form the Army of Three Guarantees: religion, independence, and unity. Iturbide wrote the El Plan de Iguala. On February 24th, that declared Mexico as an independent and sovereign nation, where the following points were established. New Spain was no longer a Spanish dependent. Catholicism became the nation's official religion, the unification of everyone, despite their African, Mexican, Asian, or Spanish roots. As an independent nation, New Spain became the Mexican Empire, and its first emperor would be Agustín de Iturbide in 1822, though he ruled for only 10 months because the empire was in an economic crisis, and its problems were overwhelming with no further funding from Spain or other countries. Additionally, General Iturbide lacked the ability to lead the nation, and its people were not happy with the new government because its policies did not help the working and poor classes who were the most affected by the consequences of independence. However, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who at the time was governor in Veracruz, recognized the problems and proclaimed Mexico as a republic and rose up against Iturbide. With the help of powerful generals like Nicola Bravo, Vicente, and Guadalupe Victoria, they fought for the people and defeated Iturbide, who abdicated his position in March 1823. After Iturbide stepped down, a supreme executive power governed the nation, and Vicente, an important member of that group. In 1824, a new constitution proclaimed Guadalupe Victoria as the first president of Mexico. In 1829, when Victoria's presidency was about to end, elections were held for his successor. The candidates were Vicente on the liberal side and conservative candidate Manuel Pedraza, who was declared the winner. Vicente's supporters did not like the results. The state legislatures voted to install Vicente's opponent, Manuel. Rather than admit defeat, Vicente refused to recognize the election results. Lorenzo de Zavala, a liberal journalist in Mexico City. On December 4, 1828, the lower classes took to the streets. They broke into upscale shops near the Central Plaza and ransacked the storerooms of the National Palace, destroying 25 million pesos worth of property within 24 hours. For the next 10 days, fires burned across the city. In January 1829, Manuel Pedraza resigned and Vicente was elected. On April 1, 1829, Vicente became the second president of the Republic. During his brief tenure, Vicente managed to defend Mexico from an attempt by the Spanish to reconquer the nation. To defend his motherland, however, he exhausted the nation's backup financial resources, which was met with disapproval from the country's aristocracy. However, he made remarkable changes to support working classes, despite the serious economic limitations. He granted rights for indigenous peoples, fought for both racially and economically oppressed people, and promoted the purchase of Mexican products. His government was clearly dedicated to the people who had many needs after years and years of conflict that left the nation with a predominantly poor class. On September 16, 1829, to celebrate the anniversary of independence with an act of justice, Vicente formally abolished slavery in Mexico, except in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the south of the country. This monumental declaration, however, would lead to his downfall. Slave owners, unsurprisingly, protested the new abolition decree. Many people, especially the wealthy class, opposed his populist egalitarian idea, and even members of his administration opposed and betrayed him. More so, European American enslavers, especially in Texas, did not like the idea of losing the economic power they had based on slavery. President Vicente's decree faced strong pushback, especially from Anglo-American settlers in Texas who relied heavily on enslaved labor for their cotton plantations. They resisted the decree, and it was later suspended. At the time, Texas was still part of the Republic of Mexico, and Vicente's order arrived in Texas, but political chief Ramon Musque's workers rejected it because it violated the colonization laws that secured the settlers' properties. Mexican officials had to enforce the nation's laws against the introduction of slaves. Americans forced hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved people to sign indenture contracts before crossing in Texas. Although slaveholders insisted that these lifelong indentures were valid under an 1828 law recognizing labor contracts signed abroad, Mexican authorities countered that the practice violated state and national laws, and that illegally imported slaves were entitled to their freedom. As Mexican leaders redoubled their efforts to enforce these laws, the Anglo colonists in Texas made good on their threats to defend their enslaved property at all costs. After 3 months of his declaration, Vicente was driven out of office. His own officials said that he did not possess the intellectual capacities to govern a nation, and he was forced to resign. He fled to southern Mexico, fearing for his life. In March 1830, he left his hacienda for the mountains, where he started to organize an uprising of his own. He called for new elections, a return to federalism, and a restoration of state sovereignty. But his rebellion came to a sudden end when the Italian ship captain named Francisco Picaluga invited him aboard his vessel, the Colombo, anchored at the port of Acapulco. Vicente accepted his friend's invitation, unaware that the captain had struck a deal with the Bustamante administration to betray him. After finishing his lunch on board the Colombo, Vicente found himself under arrest. Picaluga delivered the former president to federal troops on the port of Huatulco and then claimed his reward, 50,000 pesos. Transported to Oaxaca and tried before a court-martial, Vicente was sentenced to death. On February 14, 1831, he stood before the firing squad and was killed at the age of 39 in Coahuilpan, Oaxaca. The next day, Mexico's Congress formally abrogated all the laws, decrees, regulations, ordinances, and orders issued by Vicente under his wartime powers, including the decree abolishing slavery. On April 28, 1832, the state legislatures issued a new colonization laws that closed the loophole the Anglo colonists had been exploiting to introduce enslaved people as indentured servants. The indentures for 70, 80, and up to 90 were now annulled. Within months, enslaved people started to claim their freedom under the new law. The resistance in Texas, fueled by the slavery issue, contributed to the Texas Revolution and its subsequent annexation by the U.S., where slavery was then protected. This ultimately became a reason why Texas decided to secede from Mexico and join the United States, which still practiced slavery. The Texas Revolution inaugurated a new era of anti-slavery. The Constitution that the Republic of Texas drafted in the fall of 1836 only seemed to confirm that Anglo colonists had taken up arms in defense of slavery. All persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. Congress shall pass no laws to prohibit immigrants from bringing their slaves into the Republic with them and holding them by the same tenure by which such slaves were held in the United States. Read the 9th section of the Constitution.
Texas was founded by illegal American immigrants in the country of Mexico fighting for their right as illegals to own slaves. You see, after the Mexican War of Independence from colonial Spain that ended in 1821, the country of Mexico included 6 current U.S. states and portions of 3 others, and that included the entire state of Texas. The newly formed Mexican government initially encouraged legal immigration, and one of those very earliest immigrants was Stephen Austin, who is now considered the father of Texas. Austin had to renounce his American citizenship and become a citizen of Mexico in order to become a colonist, and he initially brought 300 families to Mexico in order to start his colony. But the land he chose to settle on was inconveniently occupied by the native tribe, the Karankawa, and almost immediately upon arrival, Austin started to kill off this tribe in order to clear the land. This all started with the Skull Creek Massacre in 1823, when 19 natives were killed and their village was plundered, and by 1825, Austin had issued an order to pursue and kill on sight any Karankawa who was found, so that by 1860, the entire tribe had either been killed off or enslaved. And this issue of slavery was the real sticking point between the colonists and the Mexican government, because almost all of Austin's colonists were farmers from the south. Of the initial 1,790 residents, almost a quarter of them, 443, were slaves. And the success of Austin's colony on the slave economy of legal immigrants led to an absolute flood of illegal immigrants that started to come across the border in order to snatch up unoccupied land that simply wasn't available in the rest of the South. And just like Austin, all of these illegal immigrants also brought their slaves with them in contradiction to the policies of the Mexican government, who repeatedly tried over and over and over again to stem this tide of slavery. In 1823, Mexico forbade the purchase or sale of any type of person and immediately freed the children of slaves upon the age of 14. In 1827, the Mexican state that encompassed Texas passed a new law that outlawed the introduction of additional slaves regardless of where they came from and freed all the children of slaves immediately upon upon their birth. And finally, in 1829, Mexico actually abolished slavery of all kinds, but wrote an exception of 1 year for the Texas colonists so that they could continue to have their slaves until 1830. And when the time ran out on this exception, the American colonists found a way around it, because both legal and illegal immigrants, rather than having slaves, decided to have all of their slaves sign indentured servitude documents, bonding them to their slave owners for the rest of their lives, essentially continuing the practice. And this continuous back and forth on this issue between the immigrants and the Mexican government caused tensions to rise until eventually there were several small skirmishes on the issue that occurred in the early 1830s. And this all started to come to a head in 1833 when General Santa Anna was elected the president of Mexico, and just 1 year later in 1834 declared himself a dictator. This led to the rebellion of several Mexican states, and after Santa Anna had put down the rebellion in the Mexican state of Zacatecas, he turned his attention to the colonists in the state of Texas. And by 1835, Texas was no longer paying taxes to the country of Mexico and was ignoring all immigration and slavery laws. They also raised an army comprised of both illegal and legal migrants in order to fight the federal government of Mexico. And after several early victories against this army of migrants, Santa Anna was eventually defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto and was captured, and the independent country, the Republic of Texas, was formed. And paramount in the constitution of this brand new country was making slavery legal again, but not only making slavery legal, but also immediately transferring all indentured servants to immediate slave status. It also did not allow slaves to be freed by their masters unless it was approved by the Congress of Texas, and also removing all rights of any person from African or Native American descent, regardless of whether they were slaves or freedmen. And the rights removed included the right to vote, the right to own land, and even the right to marry who you chose. And all of this happened because the legal American immigrants believed they had the right to own slaves in a foreign country.
Mexico abolished slavery in 1837, but it first declared it abolished in 1829, the Vicente Decree, with an exemption for Texas, leading to a second definitive abolition in 1837 that applied everywhere, making it a key factor in the Underground Railroad to Mexico. The 1829 decree by President Vicente freed most slaves but angered Anglo settlers in Texas, who wanted to keep slaves and fought for independence, only for many to flee to Mexico after the 1837 decree for true freedom. It's up to us to put our history in proper context. You got to start gatekeeping our culture. And this concludes for tonight's broadcast. Until next time, family, always remember your history.